Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesday. Boy, do we have a very important conversation for you today. I'm coming to you in the wake of the tragedies in Vegas and New Orleans, and we have a pro-Palestinian protest blocking 6th Avenue in New York City right now. This madness is a glaring symptom of the deeper moral decay that's happening in the West that radicalists are taking advantage of, and the cognitive dissonance is staggering. You know what I mean? People marching under the banner of freedom while supporting ideologies that would crush those very freedoms. This is not just naive, it is so dangerous, and that is why I'm so excited to have Yasmine Mohammed on the podcast today. We're going to unpack how the West has failed to recognize the ideological threat of Islam and how moral relativism and weak leadership have paved the way for this chaos. And it is time for clarity and it is time for courage. Yasmine is a human rights activist and author of the book Unveiled, How the West Empowers Radical Islam. And in this memoir, she shares her powerful story of escaping a forced, abusive marriage to an Al-Qaeda operative and how that experience led her to become this advocate that we're speaking to today for her nonprofit organization, Free Hearts and Free Minds. So without any further ado, let us begin. So welcome, Yasmine. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Megan.
Can you briefly share with us what motivated you to write Unveiled, how the publishing processing went, and what were you hoping readers to take away from it?
Okay, what motivated me? It was actually an episode. So I was motivated to write the book because of an episode of Real Time with Bill Maher where he had Sam Harris on as a guest. And at the time, I didn't know who Sam Harris was, which is pretty crazy because, of course, he's a very good friend of mine now. And, you know, he's a mentor and I adore and love him. But at the time, I had no idea who he was. And him and Bill Maher were talking about how liberal people in the West have forgotten about, ignored, and even betrayed free thinkers in the East, free thinkers in the Muslim world specifically. And they started to talk about how there was a recent Pew research that had been done, and it showed that close to 90% of people in Egypt believed that people like me, Muslims who renounce their religion and decide they don't want to be Muslims anymore, that they should be executed. And they were talking about this, and it really made me feel for the first time genuinely like represented. I felt seen and heard, you know, to use the vernacular. I genuinely was like, wow, this is amazing. Like, two American men on HBO are talking about essentially me because my family is from Egypt and I renounced Islam. And I didn't even care enough to care about myself, you know, because I was full of all of this self-loathing and guilt and shame that they fill you with because you've left the religion. So therefore you're, you know, demonic and gross and dirty and hateful and should be killed and all that. And I didn't realize how much I had internalized all that until I saw these two men talking as if we mattered, as if people like us mattered. And very sadly at that moment, Ben Affleck came swooping in to play the part of the useful idiot, and he started to silence the conversation. He started telling Bill and Sam that they were being racist, that the word Islamophobic hadn't come out yet, but essentially that's what he was doing. He was telling them, you're racist, you can't be saying this, Muslims are, they just want to eat sandwiches, they're not interested in, you know, this or that. And Bill and Sam were saying, hey, you know, we're just talking about the fact that in every society, there are issues that we need to criticize. And when we're here in the West, if we want to criticize issues with, you know, women's, you know, fair wages or whatever issues we want to talk about, you know, discrimination against LGBT, whatever issues, we talk about them. And, you know, that's how we have feminism today. That's how we do not have slavery anymore. Like all of these things happen because we were able to criticize the bad parts of our culture. And they were saying, you know, Ben, when you silence these conversations, essentially you are providing cover for these negative parts of these cultures to continue. You're empowering them. And why is it that we're going to care about free thinkers, free expression, freedom of sexuality, et cetera, when we're talking about the West? But why is it different for people who are born and raised in Muslim majority countries? Don't they deserve the same amount of respect? Don't women in Afghanistan deserve the same amount of respect as women in Seattle? Like, why are we separating? And, they just wouldn't listen to him, or they wouldn't listen to them, to Sam and Bill. And the next day on my Facebook, because this was back in the Facebook days, it was covered, like all my friends and family, coworkers, everybody, they were all like sharing the video clips and going on about how Ben Affleck shut down these gross and racist men, because that's what Ben Affleck called them, gross and racist. Yeah. And none of them engaged with the argument. None of the comments had anything to say insofar as like, yeah, we shouldn't criticize the fact that free thinkers are to be killed in Egypt. They weren't saying that. They were just saying these are straight white American men and they have no right to speak. So they were just attacking these men for their immutable characteristics, and that's it. And so that's when I felt compelled at that point. I felt like, okay, brown-skinned Arab woman, I'm going to say the exact same thing that these men are saying, but because it's coming from a different identity that is saying these words, perhaps it will force them to engage with the argument. And that's why I started writing my book, completely terrified. Initially, I wanted to be anonymous.
Yeah.
And I wrote my book, honestly, I wrote it like a journal because I never, ever imagined that I would be public. So that's why I was so honest in it, so raw. I was just saying everything because I'm like, no one's ever going to know who I am anyway. Right. And I just wanted to share with the world, like, this is the perspective from the inside. This is, if you want to know what it's really like to be born and raised as a Muslim girl, let me tell you. My experience growing up in Canada, going to Islamic schools, with my mom being a second concurrent wife, with being married off to an Al-Qaeda jihadi, with living in Qatar, living in Egypt, wearing niqab, head to toe in black. Let me tell you everything, so that when you provide cover and you use the word Islamophobia to silence this kind, criticizing these horrible things, just know what you're doing. I just want you to be aware of what you are empowering, what you are supporting. And so that's what inspired me to write the book, those two gentlemen. And that's why that was my hope. My hope was to reach all of these well-meaning people, because I truly and honestly do believe that a lot of this comes from a place of wanting to be the good person, wanting to be empathetic and understanding, and to respect diversity and inclusion and all that stuff. But what they don't realize is that they are ushering in some very toxic ideologies. You want to respect and love people for every shade of skin, every kind of traditional, cultural, musical, hair, you know what I mean? Sexuality, all that stuff, ages, everything. Please do respect people, love people, honor people, celebrate people. But when it comes to ideologies, what are we doing?
Right.
What are we doing? How are we celebrating or supporting or providing cover for an ideology that is so anti-women, that is so anti-minorities, that is so anti-freedom? Like it is the antithesis. It's the complete opposite of our values, complete opposite of our belief systems. But we have been told that, no, don't you dare criticize it, because that makes you the bad person. We've been gaslit, essentially, Megan. I really feel we've been gaslit. And we were told, no, you have to be okay with these horrible things that you're seeing. Otherwise, you're the bad person. And obviously, that is not true at all.
Yeah, this concept of cultural relativism, it seems like, was what you were really faced with, in your story you share that you, in your schooling, had this opportunity to go to a public school, was it? For like a little bit of time. And that's where you got a glimmer. And the art teacher, I believe it was it the art teacher? Drama. Okay. So I didn't really actually mention the story in any of my questions, actually, about what happened at the school, which is where we were just saying, like, it was your drama teacher. If you want to kind of take it away, what happened, and a brief synopsis of where you really got betrayed by this ideology personally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. It's cultural relativism. It's moral relativism. That is what ended up being probably causing the worst darkness of my life. Like, that was my first time being just completely felt helpless, hopeless, my first time trying to take my own life. It was basically, like you said, there was a moment, a small window of opportunity where I was able to go to a public school.
Yeah.
And in that year, I wasn't allowed to make non-Muslim friends. I wasn't allowed to have non-Muslim friends. And my mom found out that I had non-Muslim friends. And so she said, well, that's it. You're not going back there. You're not going to go back to a public school. And because there was no Islamic school, there was no Islamic high school at the time, she's like, well, you're just going to stay home. And so I went back to school feeling very, obviously, depressed and sad and worried that she was not going to let me come back. And that's when Mr. Fabro, who wrote the foreword for my book, that's when he approached me and he's like, yes, you're being really different. Like, is everything okay? And I shared with him. I told him everything. I told him about this man my mom married. I told him about, him making everything forbidden in our home. Like, everything was haram. Haram means like Islamically forbidden. So no music, no birthdays, no swimming, no riding bikes. It was his rule. No non-Muslim friends, like everything. That's when hijab was put on me and my sister and my mom. And it was all about praying. And if we didn't pray, or if we missed a prayer, or if we didn't memorize the Quran, we would be beaten severely. And I told him about how bad these beatings were. And I showed him the bruises and the welts. And I explained to him about how he had hung me upside down in the garage and was whipping me. And I told him everything. And I felt like, he's an adult and he will be able to help me. And even though I was scared to say all these things, I felt like I might actually be protected. And so it will be worth it. I pushed past my fear and I would say everything. And he alerted the police, who alerted social services, and it ended up becoming this big investigation with Child Protective Services. And in court, the judge said, well, this is your culture. This is just how your family chooses to discipline you. And, in Canada, we respect people's cultures. And so be it. And so after saying everything and risking everything to tell the truth, believing that I'll be okay because I'll be protected by my government, they threw me right back into the lion's den. And Megan, I cannot tell you how much worse it became, because now not only was it the physical abuse, but it was also the humiliation of, oh, did you think you were going to go to the non-believers for help? Oh, what are you going to do now? Like, what? Yeah. I couldn't even, I had no outlet. Like, at least I really felt like, because in Islam, they teach you that you do not have any control over your life whatsoever, that Allah plans it all, and you can't control your own destiny. And I believed that to be true. I was like, well, this is what Allah wants. This is what's written for me. There's nothing I can do about it. Right. So I completely submitted. I let go. I felt completely helpless. There was nothing to hope for. There was nothing to wish for. There was nothing to look to. Who was I going to look to for help from the Almighty, right? I already did what I could as a 13-year-old kid, which is, go to your school, go to your government, go to your police. But what else beyond that? They'd already spat in my face and threw me back. And so what really struck me very sharply at that time was him saying, it's just your culture. And the reason why that hurt so much was because as a Muslim, you're always taught us and them, right? The Muslims versus the non-Muslims, the good people versus the bad people, the ones going to heaven versus the ones going to hell, right? And that us and them attitude, I'd only ever felt it at home. When I was in school or in the grocery store or at the library or anywhere else, I never felt that from the Canadian community out there in the world. I didn't feel us versus them. I didn't feel them treating me differently or hating me because of who I am or treating themselves better than they're treating me or any of that, But when the judge said to me, basically, you're different. You're different. If you were a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl with family from, Germany or something, then I would protect you. But you're from Egypt and you're different. So you have to just endure. And that's the first time I felt a really strong us and them. We will protect ourselves and each other, but not you.
Right.
So it was like this, everything that my family had told me about, they hate you, they want you dead. They, just like we hate them, we want them dead. Like they acted as if it was a reciprocal relationship, and I never believed them. But at that moment, I believed it. I thought, you know what? They're right. It's true. They do hate us. This judge would protect other girls, but not me.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was, it felt like the worst possible betrayal.
The deepest. I can't imagine. I mean, that's really pretty early on in the book and in your journey. And that's probably what makes your story so courageous. I cannot imagine how broken you would feel in that moment. Plus being so young, and I do understand the concept of sovereignty of God, because in the Christian sects, Calvinism and most of Protestants will believe in that too. So, God's always in charge, God's grace. And I think it can be easily to cover a lot of messed up stuff. And that's part of why I deconstructed out of the belief as well, which I think a lot of secularists can agree on now. But, I appreciate you sharing that story for the listeners and, touching on like how this sort of cultural relativism, morals are relative, how that sort of leftist ideology is empowering their greatest fears. And that's what confuses me too about all these protests on the college campuses and the flags that they're waving. And like, I know you and I aren't fans of Trump, yet they want to and we can see his flaws, but they also want to characterize him as an extremist, which I'm not sure. It just makes no sense. So they're going to turn America into a Christian nationalist. And then while they're waving the Hamas flag, I'm just confused because I'm like, wait, so extremist. So again, you free thinker I am trying to live in the gray. I'm like, I can't fully get on board, but my heart is breaking for the death of any beautiful children, because I think we're all human and can relate to that when we come to and that might bring us into the question I wanted to add. You published this book, which you self-published, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Was it difficult? And
very. It was very difficult to get it published traditionally, like in mainstream media. They were absolutely not interested at all. I got all sorts of responses. They always started with, this is really well written. You have such a great story. However, so I don't know if it was just being polite or whatever, but nobody had the courage to print it, to publish it. They would cite Salman Rushdie and they'd say, well, we don't have the money for the security that this could potentially require. I had people say to me, well, Ayaan Hirsi Ali already wrote a book about her experience as an ex-Muslim woman, so we don't need another one, which was the most shocking to me. I got that a lot because I felt like, can you imagine saying to somebody like, oh, we already have a story from a Black woman, or we already have a story from a gay man, so we're not going to write anymore.
Yeah, we already have a Holocaust victim. We're good. Like,
Yes,
it's like, we need more
exactly.
perspectives of these like
Wow.
these crimes against humanity. And it really helps us understand. And what I'm coming to understand reading these books from Jonathan Haidt, it's correct. If I ever meet him, I hope he'll forgive me for that. But he's helping me so much with starting to find this compassion for individuals on how we can come to these intuitive conclusions, and how I do not make headway by telling them they're wrong. And that's not what we're trying to do right now. If anyone's listening to this podcast that's open-minded, we want to explain our perspectives, if you're willing to hear our stories, to help paint a more diverse viewpoint, which I think everybody in the world needs, whether it's the United States, Canada, worldwide. Diversity and perspective is how truth is found. We can't and that's where we have to question all ideas, like you said. And so I brought up the fact that your book was published 5 years ago, 2019, right? Maybe a little bit longer if we, do the month to the month. What's changed, if anything, about you personally? I mean, your views, your experiences. Obviously, we had October 7th, so that might have brought some stuff. If you want to touch on that before we move on to like your personal post effects of leaving Islam.
Mm-hmm. Yes, October 7th was definitely a huge moment. I had publishers who had passed on my book contact me on October 8th saying, I wish I had published your book. At the time, I sounded like an alarmist. At the time, I was speaking to something that I had seen and I had known very intimately. But, luckily, I guess I should say, they had the privilege of not knowing what I was talking about. And they didn't have my perspective. And they really thought that I was being an alarmist. And so they didn't want to take the risk of publishing my book. But on October 7th, the people who I have been speaking about made themselves very clear to the whole world. So now you can see what I've been saying. And now you have the same perspective that I have, unfortunately. And now we're both standing in the same spot where it's like, and now what are we going to do about it? And it was so shocking to see how Canada, America, Australia, UK, all over the world, how quickly, like almost causing you whiplash, how quickly the anti-Semitism just flared up, and how it was completely normalized to support terrorists under the guise of them being freedom fighters and revolutionaries, and ignoring or pretending to, or just denying, literally like Holocaust denial. But now it's October 7th denial. And they're saying, no, nothing happened to these women. Like it was just, we're living through such a sick time in history.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized like that the way I said it was as if the subtitle of my book had leapt off the page and was chanting through the streets of every major city, gas the Jews and all the things that they've been saying. People can see it now. You can see. And what my subtitle was, I've changed it slightly since, but initially it was How Western Liberals Empower Radical Islam.
Right.
And the reason now you can see how Western liberals have empowered radical Islam, because you can see them in the streets wearing keffiyehs and and celebrating Sinwar and celebrating the Islamic regime of Iran and celebrating Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. Like now you can see how you've empowered them, right? Now you can see how you were a part of this, and how you were the useful idiots as well, and how you are also empowering all of this. And I changed the subtitle slightly to be How the West Empowers Radical Muslims. And the reason why I changed it was because it turns out it wasn't only Western liberals. It was Western liberals at the beginning when I wrote the book. So it was September 2019 is when it was published. But since then, you start to see on the right as well.
Right.
So many of these like red-pilled, right-wing conservative people, like huge accounts, basically looking to the Taliban and looking to the Islamic regime of Iran as mentors, as like, look how successfully they have controlled their women, and look how easy it is there for men to get wives. They don't have to worry about a woman being educated and making her own money, and then him having to put in effort. You know what I mean? He just has to be a male, and then he's going to get wives, because that's the way it is in patriarchies, in like viciously misogynist countries. And they look to these, and they even, oh my God, Megan, I even saw them having arguments online about girls. They have the same arguments as Muslim men do, as far as like, if she has menstruated, then she is a woman. It's the same bullshit I grew up with them trying to convince me that Aisha was 9 years old. She got her period, so therefore she was a woman. And it was fully acceptable at that point for Muhammad to consummate the marriage with her. Like, I'm now reading this from people born and raised in America. Like, you're not born and raised in some backwater cave in Afghanistan. You're like in New York. Like, what is going on?
Yeah.
And so I realized this is not just, it was a left-wing thing in the beginning where they were the ones that were really empowering radical Islam, but then also the right are doing it as well.
Right.
And so much so that they were inviting fundamentalists, like extremist Muslims, on their channels to have these conversations. Let's see where Christianity and Islam, where we can work together to fight the evil Jews and all that. I was just like losing my mind. But it's been I think for a lot of people, October 7th has been really, really enlightening in not a good way. It's enlightening insofar as like the rug has been lifted, and now you get to see all of the filth and the vermin that have been hiding under the rug. So I guess the only good side to that is now that we can all see it, now that it's not just some of us that are seeing it and screaming, like Cassandra, like, pay attention to us.
Yeah.
Now there's more people that can see this, and more people hopefully will be responding and reacting as we should be, correctly, properly. I'm just going to give you one small example of something that used to really frustrate me so much, which was every year in like every major city around the world, there would be Al-Quds rallies, which is Al-Quds is the what they are calling Jerusalem. And they would chant Khaybar, Khaybar, which is referencing a Jewish tribe that was completely genocided by Muhammad and his followers. And they're basically talking about how they want to kill off Jews and take back Jerusalem, right? Take back Israel, make it all Arab again. Every major city, they're able to scream these chants. Nobody says anything because they're Muslim and we can't be Islamophobic. And so we just let them do that. But when, in Charlottesville, when you had those far right, KKK guys that were saying Jews will not replace us and whatnot, we responded to them correctly. We knew how to react to them because they had white skin. So it was okay to tell those guys what you're doing is absolutely wrong and we are going to push back against you. But when there's brown-skinned, women in hijab or men in beards, they're doing the same thing. They're doing worse, actually. They're actually screaming for genocide, and nobody says anything to them, and they're allowed to fill the streets year after year after year. And so I think what's happening now is people have clued in, like, oh, wait a minute. We have let this get so empowered and fester for so long. So now we have to pay attention. Now we have to push back. In Canada, we've had Muslims, and you have this in America too. You have cities where the adhan is being played 5 times a day from microphones.
Yeah.
You have Muslims praying in the streets, filling up parks and streets. They don't need to be. There's mosques everywhere, but it's a show of force, right? Christians could never get away with that. They would never be able to do that. They would be stopped immediately, right? But Muslims can do it. Nobody says anything because it's Islamophobic. But what's finally happening now in one province in Canada, Quebec, which is, they have more of a French-style secularism that pushes back against any religions that are infringing on the public's, secular safety, they are finally pushing back against these public prayers. Whereas before, if you tried to say anything about the fact that Muslims are, why are you praying in the middle? Why are you disrupting traffic like that? They'd say, oh, you're racist. Oh, you're Islamophobic. Like, again, the gaslighting, right? It's your fault for pointing out something that should be pointed out. And the double standard and the hypocrisy, like we just have millions and millions and millions of examples of that happening over and over and over again, where finally people are starting to clue in, especially after October 7th. They're starting to realize, like, oh, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't just turn a blind eye to this. Maybe we shouldn't silence any criticism of it. Maybe this is dangerous. Maybe this is a problem. Maybe we should pay attention. So obviously, I don't want to say that there's any kind of silver lining to the October 7th massacre in any way, but I'm grateful now that people are paying attention.
Yeah. Awareness is the first step to any sort of behavior change in my line of work as a, lifestyle coach, personal trainer, nutritionist. That really is true. Like, whether that's the motivation of when you get the news that you're sick and you have to make a change, it's kind of what we just got. We just got the bill that our culture is sick. We've got some things we need to address. We need to get to the root cause of this. And the root cause of this is the ideology. And when they talk about colonization, they certainly have no problem with the white skin colonization, which I mentioned before we push record. My husband's Native American. He will crush your soul with the stories from his tribe on the reservation. Soul crushing. That's why he travels the country giving them. We get it. But how the Muslims have colonized, that is not discussed. And the racism is everywhere. I lived in Japan, and let me tell you, Koreans, Chinese, and Japanese, they're not friends. At all. So racism isn't just a white-skinned thing. It is everywhere. We're tribal everywhere. And we're not going to address the problem if we're misdiagnosing it. And that's my major issue, is if we are now becoming free thinkers in this deconstruction space, then we've got to really watch ourselves for falling into any of these patterns, because it's human nature to be dichotomous in thinking. So we can, once, you know what I'm saying? Like, I want to find compassion for that. But I also want to be like, guys, if we've lived and breathed some of these experiences, then we're here to kind of call this out. So I'm excited that, we're finding each other in these communities and empowering one another. You've been seeing that. I've been seeing that. And having you on my podcast is stepping in the right direction. So I appreciate that. So in this next question, I wanted to talk about the post effects of leaving, Islam. And I talk a lot about religious and spiritual trauma on the podcast. So your story sheds light on the profound dynamics within this Islamic frameworks about the husband's authority, which, in Christian worlds, they can be somewhat familiar with that concept. But what's a little more foreign to us in the Christian world is the mother's role, and how that reinforces some serious compliance in tradition, and how both of those relationships are so deeply rooted to force control and submission by the daughters. And that's something that I found really illuminating from reading your book. So I wanted to explore some of those when you started to feel this fear about your husband. And I want to read a real quick quote from the book. I marked it. So it's on page 185 of the book. Since I was not divorced Islamically, in the eyes of Allah, I was still his wife. In heaven, men are given the choice to be with whichever of their earth wives they choose to be with. And so you were talking about this psychological ongoing fear. First, it was real because you didn't know if he was going to be arrested, or so there was still physically afraid of your fear. But then even when that had moved on, you were still afraid from just what the religion, the aftermath. So would you want to explain a little bit more about those lingering fears for us?
Yeah. Yeah. So when I got away from him, it was to protect my daughter, right? That was my main goal. Was I didn't want her to live the life that I had lived. And I knew that with him as her father, she would live a life even worse than what I had lived, which was unimaginable to me. But I hadn't questioned the religion. I hadn't questioned being a Muslim yet. It was just about protecting my daughter. And even though the decisions that I'd made at that point, which were to get divorced, to move out on my own, to start going to university, all of those things were considered shameful, dishonorable, heathen type things to do. And my mom would say to me, "You're acting like an infidel. You're going to burn in hell because of these things that you're doing." But I was more focused on providing a safe environment for my daughter to grow and thrive. So that was my main goal at the time. And I really, truly, and honestly did believe what you just read there. And in fact, it made me feel ill just hearing those words again, because that's the kind of grip this ideology has on your mind. So even when you're physically free, mentally, you're still in shackles. And I honestly believed that I would only have a few years on earth away from him, but it was worth it to me because I would use those few years to cultivate an environment for my daughter to grow and thrive. And so it was worth it to me. I was like, that's fine. When I die, I'll have to be his wife again, but I'll deal with that when I deal with it. At least my daughter, I will have saved her before I die and have to go be his wife again. So it was like worth it to me. It was a decision that I'd made at that time. But oh my God, it was so terrifying how I truly believed that there was no escaping him, especially since he was a jihadi. And in Islam, you're taught that men like him, the ones that give their lives for the sake of Allah, they reach the highest levels of heaven. They get to be in areas of heaven where only like the prophets get to be, right? And so he would be given such power and control for eternity over me, because he said it to me. He said it to me as a threat. Like, you can go ahead and leave me if you want. You can go ahead and get your little Canadian divorce all you like, but guess what? For eternity, you will be my wife. And it's like, what could be a worse threat than that, And I believed him. And so it was really, really scary. But thankfully, when I was in university, two very important things happened. One, I ended up taking a history of religions course, which focused on the 3 Abrahamic religions. And I honestly took it just as an elective on a whim, because I thought, I'll ace a third of this course. My mom is an Al-Azhar scholar. She's the head of the Islamic Studies department at the Islamic school. We had to be very versed in Islam because we didn't want to shame her. And so I knew that I would have at least a third of that curriculum down. And so was the first thing that happened, because I was basically intellectually bombarded with all of this information and knowledge about the religion that I was never allowed to question before. I was never allowed to critically analyze before. I was never allowed to think and discuss. You just have to believe, and to ask questions or to even have thoughts about what you're being taught was from the devil. And so you stop yourself from thinking, you stop yourself from questioning, and you just swallow it. And it's like a soldier in battle. There's no, you have to do, don't think. Thinking is dangerous. Thinking is punishable. So you just do what you're told. And here I am in this university classroom where I'm being encouraged to think and critically analyze and write essays about this. And, let's find some, academic sources about that. And I'm like, what is going on? So obviously that the whole religion started to unravel very quickly once you start to look at it.
Yes.
Which is part of the reason why you're not supposed to look at it. And then the other thing that happened was 9/11. So that was another very shocking thing. So as I mentioned to you, I had left him and gotten away from my family and was living on my own and going to university, but I still identified as a Muslim. But when 9/11 happened and I saw how my community, my family, my friends, everybody was celebrating the death of innocent people, it was too much. It was too much. I saved my daughter from being with this man, in him being her father and growing up with, in that life. How was I going to raise my daughter in an environment of people who celebrate the deaths of innocent people? Like, what that I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that. After pulling her out of that fire, I wasn't about to leave her in this fire, like I have to get her out of here as well. I can't raise her in an environment where people are celebrating death. Like, I'm not going to be that mother. She's not going to be that little girl. Like, this isn't going to be her life. And so, because I was being both intellectually bombarded through the class and emotionally bombarded through 9/11, that's when I started to feel like I do not want any part of this religion whatsoever. I don't want it in my life. I don't want it in my daughter's life. But that was a very scary decision to make because, of course, leaving Islam comes with the punishment of execution, right? So
you're in an apostate. You're very an apostate. And that leads me to kind of what you were saying in regards to how invigorated and inspired and like excited and awakened you got during university, and being able to analyze and think about that is also what helped you become able to challenge your mom. And on page 201, you say, I've like marked and highlighted in so much of your book, but you say, usually when my mom and I fight about something, I would concede to her wise judgment because I didn't trust my own. This time, however, I was sure I was right. That had never happened before. It was a weird feeling. In college, I was developing my critical thinking skills. I was using my brain in a way that it had never been used before. This was new and exciting, and I craved more and more. So it's like I decided to dip my toe into the possibility that I might be right and my mother might be wrong. That gives me goosebumps reading that. Share a little bit more about, you kind of were talking about like those two things with 9/11 and then this growth and experience and confidence to start facing some of this deep cultural and religious pressure. Like, you want to touch on that some? Because I just found that part so inspiring, encouraging. And some of myself, when I started to unravel out of Christianity, I was like reading so many books and feeling betrayed and also like alive at the same time. It was quite paradoxical. It was a paradox for sure.
Yeah. That was the first step in a very, very long road. It doesn't, you know this because you've been through something similar where you start to suspect like, oh, could I be right? Am I capable? Like, I don't only have to just, concede to authority and other people know more. Like, I can trust my own gut. I can trust my own mind. So that was my mom, of course, was the first and the biggest hurdle to overcome. But once that shifted, then I could start to have that kind of confidence more and more in my life. There was a TED Talk with this woman who was talking about fake it till you make it. And I can't remember her name right now, but I'll tell you afterwards. Her face is in my mind because I used to watch her TED Talk and just cry. And she talked about doing this. It sounds ridiculous, but just bear with me for a moment. Yeah, you know it. The Superwoman pose. Yeah.
Oh, I know, because I'm a circus performer. And so before I get up on stage, I would or I do piano and violin. So before I get up, or like puppeteering, vulnerable things, I would have to pump myself up. So I knew, please continue. Yeah, please continue.
That's amazing. So she was talking about that. And at that point in my life, I was a university professor. And so I have to go out and talk to grown adults. You know what I mean? And I have to know what I'm talking about and respond to their questions and engage them in discussion and yada, yada. And I'm still filled with this, imposter syndrome. And what do I know? I'm just, I was constantly being belittled. In Islam, they teach you that women are less intelligent than men. And it's all about subservience. It's everything that you can imagine, right? Like all of the most horrible parts of patriarchy. And as a woman, you're filled with self-doubt and self-hate. And And so it was so much unraveling that needed to be done. And I would do that pose, and I did fake it till you make it. And I remember when I first started teaching at this one college, the dean of the department was doing the evaluations, and he said something about my confidence in front of the classroom, and I was just like, what? Who's he talking about? Like, it was just amazing. And I was like, maybe I made it. Maybe I faked it long enough that now I've made it. It's a very long road though, Megan. Like that, it takes forever. And then you don't even realize it. Like 15, 20 years later, you realize like, oh gosh, why have I been diminishing myself? Why have I been doubting myself? Why have I been allowing people to walk all over me? I felt it in my gut. I felt the red flags. You know what I mean? There was something in my head was telling me, this isn't right. And I silenced that inner voice that was there to protect me. It was a part of me that was protecting me, and I silenced it, and I over intellectualized, and I said, oh, no, you're being judgy, or la, 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 and I didn't listen to myself.
Right.
And so even though that was the first moment, unfortunately, it's been a very long road of still unraveling through that, and that's the thing with this indoctrination is when you're young and these things are put into your mind from such a young age, it's like you don't know they're there. You don't even know they're there. And so you're trying to navigate a space and to clean up a space that you can't eat. It's like a fish. A fish doesn't know that he's wet.
Right.
And so it's really, really difficult. And it's been a long, very difficult road. And that's why I started my organization, Free Hearts, Free Minds, is to support others who are overcoming their religious trauma from being brought up in Islamic environments, Islamic communities, Islamic homes, Islamic countries, because it is essentially a very specific kind of cult. It's a cult.
Yes.
And you are indoctrinated into a cult. And so you have to do all sorts of deconstruction, reconstruction, learning who am I, just starting with figuring out your identity, because you've been told who you are, and you've been told what to think, and you've been told what to feel. And now suddenly you're almost like paralyzed with the choices around you. It's overwhelming and scary, but also exciting and and invigorating, but it's like both simultaneously. And so the organization really supports people who are going through that, because I had to go through it alone, and I never want anyone else to have to go through that alone ever again.
No. And so, to summarize the conversation, because I want to respect your time, how does this dynamic of how they're empowering these ideologies that they may not understand harm women in particular? Because women's rights is so important to the folks on the left, which I completely understand. It seems that's what I mean by the shift in the narrative. They just seem to be losing their way somehow. And you've got some clarity, perhaps. Like, what would you say to folks who are kind of lost on the sauce in this way?
Okay, so it was 2016 with the Women's March that I first had this moment of just shockingly tragic clarity, where I saw, you remember this march, right? It was with the pussy hats and everything. Yeah. So they also took an American flag, which is the most quintessential symbol of freedom, and they contorted it into a hijab, which is the most anti-woman possible tool of misogyny in the world that we have today. And these women they are protesting. They are trying to be supporting women. You think that you're being feminists by taking this hijab and putting it on your posters, while women are literally rotting in prisons in Iran as you are walking through the streets of DC because of this hijab. There's morality police that are beating women to death, raping women to death. Girls have been killed all over the world in honor violence and honor killings. I tell my story of hijab in my book and how my mom threatened to kill me when I took off my hijab. This is the thing that you chose to be the symbol when you're talking about women's rights. I mean, it was just beyond ignorance.
Yeah.
It was such a betrayal. I had the worst migraine that day. Like, I was so full of so much rage and so much, just how could so much injustice? This is so unfair. It's so horrible.
Right.
And knowing full well that the Islamists that have been spending their billions of dollars, as we can see now with what's happening in the universities, right? They had been spending their billions of dollars spreading their propaganda in corporations, in governments, in universities, and I could see it being successful. I could see these people who thought that they were leftist, progressive, feminists. I saw them taking this tool of misogyny, putting it on Barbie's head, putting it on the cover of magazines, the cover of Sports Illustrated, putting it on Disney movies and Spider-Man movies and every app or advertisement, basically any flat surface. They're putting this hijab everywhere as if it's the symbol of freedom, of women's empowerment and women's freedom
and diversity. And diversity.
Diversity. Like,
yeah.
What are you talking about? We're not even referencing history, for example. Like, this is happening right now. And you guys are just so cruel to take something that is getting women killed currently in this moment and then pretending that it's a symbol of empowerment and a symbol of freedom and a symbol of diversity. And so that's one example. That was the first moment for me where I felt like, you know what? You guys are so incredibly gullible. Like, you have just been fooled, which is really shocking to me. Like, it's hard for me to understand that because I grew up in a world where free the nipple was something that people would say. Like, why can't women walk around topless if men can walk around topless? Like, you understand, like, we talk about slut shaming. We talk about victim blaming. We talk about rape culture. Like, we understand modesty culture, purity culture. These are not new concepts to you. You have no trouble criticizing the Baptist long denim skirt or the Mormon underwear, or there's no moral ambiguity there. Like, you get it. But somehow seeing a woman or a little girl wrapped up in hijab or worse in niqab, and you're going to pretend that that's not oppressive to these women? You're going to pretend that you're okay with that? Like, you can't be that, like, your brain can't be that broken.
It can't be.
No way. It can't be.
And that's why
obvious.
Yeah. And that's why I'm having so much hope. I'm like, I can't lose hope in the folks who have gotten into this I feel like I got radicalized during the pandemic to kind of go far right, but I got out of it. So now I'm hoping for my friends who got radicalized. It went kind of like during the pandemic, two ways. We had let's hit the mic because I'm talking with my hands. We went radical on the left, radical on the right. So I'm hoping that through, stuff, the clarity coming through from whatever was happening over the last 4 years, that we can start to see things more in the gray, start to see the aftermaths, the effects of what this is, how it's shaken out, because it's not really working out very well. And I really appreciate the passion that you bring to that, because the other thing is the Handmaid's Tale, that book's been flying off the shelves. They're saying America's like that. And I think that is completely hyperbolic and unacceptable. Like, yes, we are looking at a weird shift with states' rights and abortions, but it's very nuanced, and we should try to cover the topic as effectively, especially those free thinkers, focusing on facts instead of misinformation, which is very difficult to do on left or the right. But that's been my concern too. I was like, guys, there are women who are living lives much closer to the handmaid's tale, and it's not here in America. You are doing such a disservice. Would you like to speak to that in closing of the conversation? Because that's really breaking my heart. I've seen so many women posting that since Trump won, that like, and I get their pain and their misery. I really do. I want to speak to that as well. I don't want to shame them, but I think it's important to not be hyperbolic about what we're experiencing. Does that make any sense?
Of course it makes sense. Absolutely it makes sense. I mean, you're absolutely correct. We're talking about a shift from federal laws to state laws right now. Like, yes, we have to put in some work. It's going to take some effort, but you know what I mean? This is what progress is about. It's about making things more stable going forward into the future anyway, because Roe versus Wade was unstable. And so
yeah. And I was reading more about how Ruth, their feminist icon, she was even saying how she wished it had gone a little slower because it might have been more stable. So if they want to slow down and actually read what was going on, that's what happens when we get super amped up. We won't be able to think clearly that way. So it's just so important to understand. It's called amygdala hijacking. Our amygdala gets kicked in. I did a whole podcast on it because I'm fascinated seeing how we all fall for this, and just finding compassion for myself and for others and trying to see through that moment for them, like common humanity. And I'm hoping that can be some of the glue that brings us out of all this polarization and this not making sense.
Yeah. But what you were saying about it being so hyperbolic is absolutely true. And in fact, I think it was Dolly Parton's sister. I can't remember what her name is right now. She tweeted something about, it's the Christian Taliban in America that are like, that they're the ones that are to blame for this. And I responded to her, and of course she's blocked me, but what I was responding to was how incredibly she doesn't even realize how she sounds like, sorry to use the term because I hate identity politics, but like you are now being that privileged white girl that is so clueless and living in some other like stratosphere. You just went ahead and compared your situation to the Taliban. Are you fucking kidding me? Where women can't leave their homes, they can't go to the park, they have to cover themselves head to toe. They can't go to school.
They can't see a doctor.
Did you just
right? Yeah.
Yes. You're going to compare yourself to that situation. Like, let's just take a step back now. Like, okay, you're going to have some hard work, getting these laws passed at the state level, but please, for the love of everything holy, understand that you are living in a free country, that you are living in a democracy. You're living in the freest country in the world, in fact, and you have the ability, the right, the mechanisms, the support, the infrastructure to be able to make these changes. Do not for 1 second compare yourself to women living under the Taliban. Like it's such an insult. It's such an insult. It's diminishing what these women are suffering from, how these women are living, and you're making yourself look horrible. You're standing there with like a fucking paper cut, complaining to somebody in the, with a fucking gunshot wound and saying, "Oh, look at my finger." That's what you sound like. Like it was just that's it.
And what's also
enraging to me,
it is enraging. And then when many of us, like Christians, ex-Muslims, anyone who's coming out of these extremes ideologies, where do we find a home? If those who call themselves liberal, if those who call themselves the ones fighting for democracy are also then getting confused up in this, it's like, that's why a lot of us in America like did end up voting for Trump, because we're like, what's going on right now? The left failed us so hard, and they don't even want to talk about it right now. And I'm like, no, you failed us. Like, and so that was like really upsetting for me to see like them get so lost. And I think the left is fighting. It's like the old liberals. They were like actually liberals, like how the rest of the world sees liberals and liberalism. They're still there, and we need them to be courageous, like the ex-fundamentalists, like we are. We are very courageous. You put your life on the line. I'm ex-Christian, not so much. It's not the 1400s, but nonetheless, we need them to be courageous to get their party back, because like that just breaks my heart that like this freedom can't be the safety net for us coming out of a fundamentalist or a cult, like anyone who leaves Mormonism. So, in summary, like, not only are you making yourself look like an asshat, but you're taking away from the core fundamentals that you actually want to believe in. So there's a major mismatch here in like how you actually want to be representing yourself in the world. And that aches my heart for them.
100% agree. And it's not like, I think I wouldn't have been so angry if she actually ever mentioned women living under the Taliban under any other circumstances. Do you know what I mean? Like we only get cited, or we only get spoken about when it's to be used as a bludgeon to attack Trump.
Right.
Or, then suddenly they remember who we are. But like Women Life Freedom Movement from Iran, I'm sure you've heard about it. Those women risking their lives, standing in the streets, burning their hijabs, while the IRGC are standing there with guns, shooting these women in the eyes, in the breasts, in the genitals. Like they taking these girls into prisons and raping them and killing them. Like and they're still out there fighting. They're still out there trying to get their message out to the world. How they are being just, the level of courage that these women have, they're superhuman, and it's still not enough. It's still not enough. People still don't want to support them. People still don't want to support the feminists in Iraq that are pushing against, because in Iraq right now, they're trying to bring back the marriage age from 18 down to 9. And when those feminists try to speak up against this, those women feminists are told, oh, you're Western puppets, you're blah, blah, blah. Are they getting support from Western feminists? Absolutely not. They are not. Are the women in Egypt who are trying to criminalize domestic violence getting support? No, they are not. But they will use these women when they want to blame Trump for something. And I think that's the major difference, because as you said, neither of us are fans of Trump. Neither of us are fans of religious fundamentalism. Like, obviously I'm not a Republican conservative, but when I am trying to have a conversation with somebody, a rational conversation that is bringing in different perspectives, different ideas, ask me now, because everybody knows the answer to this. Try to have that conversation with somebody on the left versus having that conversation with somebody on the right. I can disagree with somebody on the right, and then we can have a drink and walk away, right?
Yep.
Somebody on the left, they will have demonized me, doxed me, started rumors about me, covering me in racial slurs and all sorts of horrible things. Like, that's what I get on the left. It is literally a cult mentality, exactly like the one that I escaped from. The same policing of each other. Yep. You see the people within the left, within the progressive left, and I'm seeing this very much now since October 7th, because you're seeing Jewish people, you're seeing LGBT people, you're seeing them all, and women, you're seeing them afraid to speak.
Yes.
They're like, but this doesn't make sense. But they kill gay people. You know what I mean? But they kill women. And how can I support them? But you better not open your mouth, because you will be demonized. And so that not being able to speak your mind, that Orwellian, totalitarian control on the left, that is much scarier to me than anything on the right at this point in time.
Correct.
Because of the amount of power and control that they have over our media, over our journalism, over everything, our education, our government. And so I feel like it is coming from a world where you have to think a certain way, you have to speak a certain way, you have to believe certain things. I intimately understand how dangerous that is.
Yes.
And so when I see it on the left, it is just red flag central right now. Like, it's just flaring.
That's how I felt. when I, left evangelicalism, and because I'd spent so many years in Portland, Oregon, and the left had already kicked me out during the COVID stuff because I got really sick with the original bioweapon strain, which I can now say it's not a conspiracy theory since the 2-year investigation just dropped last week. And I was really sick, and the doctor said, no, we're not giving you this vaccine. You don't I literally was given the free pass, but that I still was dehumanized. Judge, I have a degree in biochemistry. My husband literally has worked in some of the most craziest anthrax labs. We are not anti-science. We are not, but I got categorized like I was a QAnon freak. And it was heart shattering for me. My friends, I thought they loved me and knew me, that I was a smart individual, and I could still cry. So yeah, the left really broke up with me, and I felt that very much. And that's kind of how I found myself surrounded by Trumpies and Christians. And that's how I got radicalized into it. Right. And I came out of it. And now I'm back with all these lefties who are anarchists and hate capitalism and hate America. And I was just like, this is the same team. Y'all just switched hats. Mm-hmm. You help me feel seen, that I am not crazy. That even though I feel the most isolated I've ever felt in my life, I'm almost happy to be here because I'm not underneath some of the radicalization on either side, but it feels very lonely. But that's why I listen to all of your episodes. I love the Q&As that you do. It looks like maybe you could share more about how we could join in and support you and share more about your Free Hearts, Free Minds. And in closing, just is there one more, looking back on your journey, is there one piece of advice that you could give someone who is leaving a high control environment or deconstructing a belief system and they feel isolated or scared? Is there anything you can say to that to close down our conversation?
Yeah, it's not going to sound, believe it or not, the uncomfortable safety that you're feeling right now, as scary as it is to walk outside of it, to enter that unknown territory, as much as you think it's going to be so much worse than what you're living now, I promise you, you will remember this. Hear my words when I tell you this. I promise you, I am 100% positive. I promise you, if you push yourself outside of that comfort zone where you don't belong, I promise you, you will be so much happier. You will feel so much better. Megan, you hit the nail on the head when you said, even though it's isolating, you're not surrounded by a tribe. You're not surrounded by a community. You're not on the left. You're not on the right. You are in the middle, in this gray area. We are not tribal. We are all it's like herding cats, because each one of us is a free thinker, and so we're social animals. We need that support. But despite the fact that you don't have that, you are freer today. You are happier today. You are the best version of yourself that you have ever been today, because you pushed yourself outside of those boxes that they were trying to put you in. Yeah. And that's what people need to know, because we freeze.
Yeah.
We do that, fight, flight, or freeze. We freeze and we're like, okay, well, this is just what I have to do. This is just what I have to say. I have to pretend that there's no biological difference between men and women, because that's what I have to do. I have to say this, I have to pretend that I don't know what a woman is. I have to, because my job relies on it, or my friends rely on it, or, my reputation, or my whatever. But you know that you are lying to yourself, and that will rot your soul. It will rot your soul. Cleanse your soul, speak the truth, live your truth, no matter how much it hurts, no matter what you lose,
right?
Because you will get, everything will be better. You will lose some things, but what you will gain will be so much better. So that's my message to anyone in that position, is keep going forward. Follow your heart, follow your mind, follow your gut, follow your internal compass. You know what to do.
Yeah.
It's just hard, but you'll be okay. You'll be better.
Thank you. I personally needed that pep talk, and I hope the listeners can feel that as well. And where's the best place for us to, support your any of your foundations? I will have all the links in the show notes, but would you just like to close with a little bit of that? and how they can reach you. I'll link your podcast as well.
Sure. Thank you, Megan. So yeah, you can go to my website, yasminemohammed.com. My organization is called freeheartsfreeminds.com. I'm also co-director of the Clarity Coalition. Like you mentioned, my book is Unveiled, How the West Empowers Radical Muslims. I've got my podcast, the Yasmine Mohammed podcast. You can find me on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. And you can join my podcast community, like you're mentioning, Megan. So if you go to my website, just click on join the community, and then you will get links to join any of my podcast conversations. And then you can engage with the guests just like I do, ask them any questions or share any comments that you have with them. And even after the podcast, the community continues discussing what happened in the podcast. And so it's a safe space to come and say what you want to say and question what you want to question. And everybody there, even if we disagree, everybody there is very respectful of each other and very understanding that the world is beautiful because it is full of diverse thinkers.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
As well as diverse bodies.
Yes.
We have to also celebrate the diversity of thought.
Yes.
Because that's how we progress for real.
For real. And I love the Q&A. I really do. Thank you guys for listening. And please follow up if you want to learn more about what she does. That's all I have for you today, folks. Thanks again for listening. And if you've yet to leave a 5-star review, I would love it if you could take the time to do so. That helps get this podcast out to more listeners. Please share it with a friend, or I'd love to hear from you. Do you have some feedback? What do you think? And until next time, stay curious, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in. Have a great week.